Go ahead, Kevin, you are live.
Okay. All right, guys. Let's begin. All right. So first, let's just go over what we learned last week. Let's go over it briefly. All right. So we learned about the chessboard, about each piece, what the goal of the game is, how to notate, how each piece moves, some special moves such as en passant, castling, what happens when you promote a pawn, how to prevent check, how you can end with a draw, and some basic checkmates. Does anyone have a question from last week? Anything about last week? Any questions about last week on any of the things? All right, so I sent you guys some puzzles after when last week ended. So let's just go over the answers to these puzzles. All right. So puzzle number one, it was white to move, checkmate in one move. This king. So you have to try to checkmate the black king to make sure it's in check, but it has no moves to no legal moves to go to. So currently the king can't go to the G4 square. That's the only square the king can't move to, and it also can't move to the G6 square. All right, so it can't go to the G4 square over here because the pawn is attacking that square, and it can't go to the G6 square obviously because his own bishop's there. But he can go to any other square. He can take the bishop on F6. He can go to E6. Oh, he can't go to E5. My bad. He can't go to E5 because the bishop and the knight are attacking it. He can go to E4 and he can go to F4. So, what white move would checkmate the king? Anyone know? It's in one move. Anyone have any guesses? All right, well, the right answer is knight to G5. So when you move the knight to G5, you expose your queen to check the king, and the knight, the king can't take the bishop because the queen will be supporting it. The knight's not in the way anymore, remember that. The king can't go here because the pawn, the king can't take the knight because the bishop can take it. The king can't take the bishop because the queen will take it. King can't go to E6 or E4 because the knight is guarding both squares, and the king can't go to E5 because the bishop will check it. All right, so that's the answer to puzzle number one. Anyone have any questions on that? All right, let's go to number two. All right, so number two, it's also white to move, checkmate in one. There's actually two answers to this one. Anyone have any guesses?
White knight to C3.
Yep, that's one of the answers. And the other one is knight to G3. White knight to G3. All right. Wait, there's actually two more checkmates. All right, there's actually four checkmates now. I just saw this. All right, so you can either go knight to F2, knight to C3, knight to D2, knight to G3. Yeah. Okay. Because the king will be in check, he can't move anywhere here. Because the pawns are attacking it and the knight is checking it. All right, so that's it. Puzzle number three. White to move checkmate in two. Anyone have a guess? All right, this one is a sacrificial checkmate. You have to sacrifice one of your pieces to get this mate. So you move your rook to G8, check. So the only move in the situation is for the black rook to take it because the king has nowhere to go. and the only ways to prevent this check is by capturing. There's no way to block or run. So the black rook has to take it. And if the knight takes back, you are just basically losing a knight because the king takes back. So instead of taking with the knight, you move your knight to f7, and then the king will be in checkmate. You guys see that? You guys understand? So the answer is rook to g8, rook takes g8, and then knight to f7. Checkmate. The king can't get out because this knight is guarding that square, and his own rook is blocking his other escape. All right. Puzzle number 4. This is white to move checkmate in 2. All right. This one is also a sacrificial checkmate. Anyone have any guesses? All right. So the answer in this one is rook to c8. Check. That would be checkmate if this knight wasn't here. If this knight wasn't here and instead it was here, that would be almost checkmate, because then the knight would have to block and then he takes back. The king has nowhere to move there. But since this knight is here, the knight can just take it. Well, that doesn't matter. Even after rook c8 and knight takes it, you move your knight to f7, and that's checkmate. So you're basically moving your rook here, checking, to get this piece out of the way, so you can move your knight and checkmate. If let's say you go rook to c8, and instead of taking, you can also play, black can also play knight to e8, but then you just take it again, and that's checkmate. Yeah, that's it on that puzzle. Okay, this is a checkmate in 3 moves for black to move. This is also sacrificial checkmate. You have to sacrifice a piece to get to it. All right, so anyone have any guesses? All right, so this one, you can see that this square right here is a weak square for white. If I can get my queen there, that'd be very good, because then the king has to move to h4, and then you can move your queen to h2, and that'd be checkmate. So you have to try to somehow get your queen here. So the only way to do that is by moving your knight. And if you wanted to be, you can just move your knight anywhere, but then it would allow for white to block it. So that's why you have to take knight takes f4 check. So he has to do something about that knight. So if I just went knight to e7 or something to get the knight out of the way, he could have just went queen f3. And after I take with my queen, he takes with his rook. So instead, you take his pawn with check. So he has to take back. It doesn't matter with what piece he takes. You go queen g2 check. He has to go king h4, and then you go queen h2 checkmate. All right, so those are the puzzles. Anyone have any questions on any of these? All right, so let's get on with today's lesson. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the chess stages. So there's 3 stages in chess: the end game, the opening, the middle game, and the end game.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll be starting with the opening. All right. All right, so at the start of a new game, all the pieces occupy their starting positions, and the first few moves are the going to make that you're going to make are known as the opening. Chess stages.
Okay.
So there's 3 stages in chess. You wanna mute? I can. The opening, the middle game, and the end game. I can hear you.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll be starting with the opening. All right.
Okay.
All right, so at the start of a new game, all the pieces occupy their starting. I need to mute this guy. The first few moves are the going to make that you're going to make are known as the opening. John Bob, do you want to mute? Also, there's Okay. All right. So let's go back to the present. All right. So the first few moves you're gonna make are known as the opening. You may be wondering what the best move is to make during the start of the game. And this is a good question because there are some good moves and some bad moves. Uh, so in this lesson, we'll be finding out how to make good moves in the opening. All right, before I can continue, I want to explain that that a chess game usually has three stages. As I just said, it's the opening, middle game, and end game. But once you completed your opening moves, once you complete the opening moves, you reach the second stage known as the middle game. And then after you complete the middle game, where most of the action takes place, and most pieces and pawns will be captured or exchanged in the middle game, then you will reach the end game, which is known as where there are less pieces on the board. All right, so first, we're gonna focus on the opening. So right from the start of the game, you should make good moves and avoid bad ones, because uh, if you can do this consistently, you will improve your chances of winning the game. So to help you find good moves, I'm going to tell you three things that you should do and three things that you should not do. Okay. All right. So the first thing you should do is focus on the center of the board. Focus in the middle of the board. The squares in the middle of the board are known as the centers, and you should aim to control these squares. Okay. So in the opening, you should mainly focus your attention on the center. So in this situation, if I ask you which opening move is better, what would you guys say? Don't read that on the bottom, by the way. Okay, so obviously the moving the pawn to e4 is better because it helps you control the center. So you should realize now that the moving the pawn to e4, the one in the center, is a better move because it helps you control the center. Whereas moving the pawn on the side won't really help you in controlling the center. All right, so why do you guys think it's important to control the center? Anyone have any guesses? Okay, so I'll go ahead. All right. Well, all the squares are important on the board, but uh, the center is the most important because of most of the action in the game will happen around the center. So if you control these squares, you have an advantage basically. And another reason why it's important to control the center is that your pieces can do more when they are near the center. So all right. So here's what I mean. All right. So in this situation, on the board on the left, the bishop's on the side of the board, and it can only control two files, and it only can uh, direct its aim at like one side. But in the board on the right, and the bishop's in the center of the board, and it has full range over the entire board. All right. So a piece in the center attacks many directions, while a piece on the side only attacks one direction. All right. All right. Another example of that. Okay, look at these knights. All right. So the knight on the board on the left, it's on the side. It only controls 4 square, while the knights on the right board controls 8 square because it's in the center. So there's a saying in chess. It's called "a knight on the rim is dim." So that basically means if a knight's on the side of the board, it's not very active. All right. Well, there will obviously be some exceptions, but most of the time this is true. All right. The second thing you want to do is it's called development. All right. Development simply means you should move out your pieces and bring them closer to the action so that they can help you fight. All right. All right. So look, here's an example. What should white do in this opening situation? he can I'm giving you two options here. What do you think is better, moving a pawn to a4 or moving knight to c3?
Knight to c3.
Yeah, knight to c3 is the better move because the knight's still on the starting square, and we need to develop him. So it's usually much better to develop a piece than to move a pawn. In fact, you shouldn't move too many pawns in the opening, except for the pawns in the center, because moving them helps you control the center, and also it opens up diagonals for your bishops to develop. So that's the second thing you should do in the opening: develop your pieces. And it would be even better if you could develop them towards the center. All right, the third and final thing you should do is castle. All right, remember how to castle? We went over this last week. You have castling is the interaction between your king and your rook, and it makes your king safer. All right, so in this situation, both players are busy developing their pieces, and white is ready to castle at this stage, and black will probably castle on his next move as well. The reason why you should aim to castle in the opening is that your king will be safer when you move him away from the center, and this move will help you develop the rook that's otherwise stuck in the corner of the board. It's also good to connect your rooks. Like you see the rook on a1, after your rook gets to f1, it's better if they are connected. They can provide support for each other. So the way that they can connect is after castling, you have to develop your queen. All right, so yeah, okay. And now he can move his queen, and the rooks are connected, and being connected makes them stronger because they can protect each other. So these are the three things you should do in the opening. All right, focus your attention on the center, develop your pieces, and castle. All right. But all right, here are three things you should not do in the opening. All right. First, don't make too many pawn moves. Okay. You should use the time to develop your pieces instead of making useless pawn moves. All right. So if pawn moves don't necessarily help you develop your own pieces, it just wastes your time. All right. In this situation, black made too many pawn moves, and now he's behind in development. Look at all of white's pieces, and all of them are active, while black's pieces are still in still in their starting positions. So instead of making these pawn moves, black should have just developed his own pieces. All right, the second thing that you shouldn't do in the opening is you shouldn't develop your queen very early. Okay. All right, so I did tell you to develop your pieces in the previous examples, but developing a queen is not a good idea because this 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 makes your queen prone to attacks, and it helps white develop his own pieces. So like in this situation, uh, white can develop his knight and attack the queen at the same time. So in the board on the right, white does that, and so now black has to move his queen back. So let's say he moves it to f6 as shown in the board. White can again develop his other knight, move it to the center, and he's attacking the queen and the pawn on c7 at the same time. So this is just a better situation for white. He has 1, 2, 3 pieces developed, while black only has one. All right. So you can see that black wasted 3 moves with this queen, and at the same time, white managed to develop some of their pieces, whereas black made no progress. So this is why you shouldn't bring out your queen too early. It's better to wait until the other pieces are developed, and then it would be easier to decide where to place your queen. All right, so look at this position. White's development is making good progress, but they still must develop the queen and the rooks. So White already castled, but still must develop the queen. And because your queen is the most valuable piece, you ideally shouldn't move her near danger. So here the queen should move to either d2 or e2, connecting the rooks once he moves there. All right. Uh, all right. So the third thing that you shouldn't do in the opening is that once you have castled, you should not move the pawns in front of the king. Since they act as a shield to defend your king from sudden checks or attacks. All right. The pawns in front of your king serve as a shield to protect him. That's why it's usually not a good idea to move these pawns away. All right, if you move these pawns, it will open up your king, and this could very well become a big problem in the middle game. All right, so to conclude for the opening, uh, in the opening stage of the game, you should focus your attention on the center. You should develop your pieces as quickly as possible, and you should try to castle. And then you should not take too many pawn moves, rather develop your pieces. You should not bring out your queen too early, and you should not move the pawns in front of your king once it's castled. If you're not sure about what move you should make in the opening, think about the things that you learned now. All right. All right, so now we're gonna be moving on to the middle game, and we'll be learning how to find good moves there. All right. All right, so in the middle game, all right, so there's a lot of information available in like books and videos and courses all over the internet on how to play the middle game in chess, but many of these sound great, but like in theory and in practicality, it's very impossible to apply into your own game. So, and contrary to what you've possibly been made to believe, the middle game is not so much about planning for the long term. In fact, it's about getting small advantages for advancing into the end game. All right. So we're now going to be doing the same thing as the opening. I'll be telling you 3 things you should do and 3 things you should not do in the middle game. All right. All right. So first of all, make as many threats as possible. You should make as many threats as possible. Usually, most of the fighting action happens during the middle game, and you should try to make as many threats as possible. In chess, we say you should put pressure on your opponent. It's usually a very good idea to make a threat because once you put pressure on your opponent, you increase the chances that they can make a mistake, which could allow you to win material or to make an exchange that's in your favor. When you make a threat, your opponent is usually forced to deal with that threat, and that also means they don't get the opportunity to make their own plans because they must find a way to stop your threats. So if you can make a threat, that is often a good idea, but of course you must first check that your opponent doesn't have any threats against you. So if your queen is hanging, you shouldn't like go and attack his rook with your bishop or something. You're just gonna lose your queen. All right. So let's show you an example of what it means to make threats. All right, on the board to the left, White's bishop is on the d2 square, partially developed, but it does not it doesn't it's practically not useful in that position. So you're basically trying to move him into a more useful square. So that's why you move into bishop to f4, and that threatens black's queen. Okay. All right, it threatens to capture black's queen. So black's queen has to move, and so let's say it moves to b6, queen b6. You can, you see the rook on a1, the rook on a1 in the corner. That's also not very active. So you can just move that to b1, and it threatens the queen again. So that's basically what it means to make threats. You're trying to trying to put as much pressure on black as possible, so that he can eventually succumb to a mistake. All right. Um, all right, so black has to move his queen again, and then now now you can develop your pieces. Now you can control the center as part of the opening, as I said. So it's not too late to do that in the end game, but uh it's you can still do that in the middle game. And also moving your knight to e5, it also attacks the pawn on f7. So that also threatens the pawn, and it also threatens the bishop on g5. So it's threatening two things at the same time. And then that leads for black's bishop, that forces black's bishop to go back to e6. All right. So after, yeah, so that basically what it means to threaten pieces. Uh, all right, so but even so, you can still see how white made small improvements in their position by making threats, whereas black never got a chance to do anything. All right, so since he had to deal with all the threats against him, he couldn't improve his own position. So that's why it's a good idea to make threats. And this brings me to the second thing, which is if you can't make a threat, then see which of your pieces should be further developed. All right, so if you can't make it, in this position, you can't make a threat. So which piece is the least active in this position? The rook on f1, right? So at this stage, it's important that you understand the difference between a passive piece and an active piece. So when one of your pieces isn't well developed, as is the case with the rook on f1, then we say that that piece is passive, okay? So the rook on f1 is a passive piece because it does not perform a particularly useful role. It doesn't help white's position in any way. All right, passive means the piece isn't doing much, and you should try to improve the role of that piece. You can make this rook more useful by moving it to e1. Uh, this puts more pressure on the center. All right. Uh, Now the rook defends the knight on e5 and also attacks the center. Okay. All right, the third thing that you should do in the middle game is chase or exchange your opponent's pieces if they get too close, all right? So in this example, black just played knight e5 and now he's threatening to place his knight on d3 where it will become very useful. So you don't want his knight to get to d3. So you're trying to get rid of it or exchange it. So bishop takes e5 uh neutralizes this threat. All right. I'm sure that you can see if the knight gets to d3, he'll be very active. He'll be threatening the pawn on b2. Your rook won't be able to come to the e file anymore because the knight will attack the e1 square. And so all in all, it would be a problem if the black knight for white if the black knight got to the d3 square. So that's why bishop takes e5 is a good move. He should exchange the knight before it becomes too active. If white doesn't do this right now, for example, if he plays rook on the f1 square to d1, then black will put the knight on d3 and it will become a very active piece. All right. All right, so here's another example. All right, so the rook e2, the black rook on e2 becomes very active. So white should try to exchange it or chase it away. Since you can't really exchange it right now, so you can't take the rook on e2 with your queen because then the black rook would take it back. That's not a very good trade because it's a queen for rook. Queen is 9 points, rook is 5 points. So on rook on e2, black's rook is threatening to capture your pawn on c2 because his queen is also attacking that pawn. So there's two pieces attacking that pawn, but only one defending it. All right, so you're trying to chase or exchange this rook and try to get it away from the square by any means. So a good move for doing that is knight d4. White plays the knight to the d4, attacking the rook at the same time he defends the pawn on c2. The black rook must go back to a safe square, probably e5 or e7. All right. To summarize, the three things that you should do in the middle game is, first of all, make threats when you can, develop your pieces further if you can't make threats, and chase your opponent's pieces or exchange them if they become too close. All right. Now in the second part, we're going to be talking about the three things you shouldn't do in the middle game. All right. The first thing that you shouldn't do is don't exchange your most active piece for your opponent's passive pieces. Here's an example. All right. Your knight is on e5. It is very active. It's in the center of the board, and it's attacking many squares, right? However, on the other hand, the black's bishop's on d7, and the black's bishop really doesn't do anything because it's being blocked by its own two pawns, so it's not very active. So you should probably not exchange these two pieces because that would be a bad trade on your part. Of course, you should consider whether the black bishop could suddenly become very active, and in that case, you may want to make the exchange, but in this case, that's not the case. So don't exchange your active pieces for your opponent's passive pieces, unless you're winning points. Like if that's a rook, on the other hand, you should probably do that because knight is worth less than the rook. All right. So another tip that you shouldn't do is don't move your pawns unless you have a good reason to do so. Okay. All right. So in this situation, um. in this situation, playing the pawn to c3 would turn your d3 square very weak. All right. If you move your pawn to c3, there's no other piece supporting that or attacking that square. So black's knight can just move there. All right. So you should probably not move your pawn to c3. Don't make unnecessary pawn moves. All right. So in particular, avoid moving pawns in front of your king, as I said before, because it would expose them and make your king vulnerable. This doesn't mean you never move the pawns. Sometimes it is acceptable to move the pawn on the side if it serves a clear purpose. All right. H3, on the other hand, would serve a good purpose because it attacks the bishop and it moves it away from threatening your knight. All right. So now let's go back to the queen side. So as we said, c3 is a bad move, but however, a good move on this side would be to move your pawn to d3, because this activates room for your bishop and also limits the squares that the enemy's black knight can go to. All right. All right. And also d3 supports the e4 pawn, and it doesn't weaken your defense by any means. All right. And then the third thing that you should not do during the middle game is don't make waiting moves. All right. Don't make moves that are unnecessary. So, like in this case, don't just move your king to h1 because you don't know what to do. Always make moves that make sense and that help your position. All right. All right. So always try to find things that are useful. All right. So in summary, the things that you should do in the middle game are try to make as many threats as possible, develop your passive pieces into more active squares, and if an enemy piece gets into your territory, try to chase it away or exchange it. The three things that you shouldn't do is don't exchange your active pieces for your opponent's passive pieces, don't move your pawns unless you need to, and don't make waiting moves. Don't make useless moves. Sorry. Okay, so an important reminder. So when you play chess, an important thing you should always consider is always be careful, right? Carefulness is an important skill. So the thing is, if you make 10 or 20 good moves and then you make one bad move, all the 10 and 20 good moves that you made are reverted. They cancel out. So always be careful. And since there are so many pieces on the board during the middle game, it's easy to overlook something and make a mistake. But be careful. Don't make it easy for your opponents to beat you. All right. All right. So the third and final stage is the end game, right? So so now we're gonna be talking about the end game in chess. So in the middle game, there are many pieces and pawns on the board, but when there's only a few left, we reach the end game. So the end game is when there are only a few pieces remaining on the board. All right. So one of the most important characteristics of the endgame is that your king is not in big danger anymore. All right. Uh, since there's only a few pieces left on the board, they can't effectively attack your king. They can't checkmate you when there's only this many pieces on the board. So a good idea is to bring your king out into the action. So since there's only a few pieces left, they can't really attack your king. So a good idea would be to help your other pieces by moving your king in. Right. So that's the first thing that you should do during endgame. Move your king in the board. So here's an uh here's an example of moving the king into the attack. So in, uh So, so in this position, you're trying to move your king to b5 to attack the pawn that's already attacked by your white knight and defended by the black knight. Okay, so you have to try to move the king to the b5 square. It attacks two pieces at the same time once it gets there. So once the king becomes active by going from e2 to d3 to c4. White achieves a big advantage thanks to the active king, while black's king is still on the other side of the board, right? So white quickly gets an advantage now because black's king's too far and he can't support his pieces in any way, right? So look what happens after king moves to f8. After king moves to f8, king can move to b5, all right? And after king moves to b5, the king is attacking both the a5 pawn and the knight on c6. So the black knight has to move in this situation, and you can take a pawn and eventually promote the pawn into a queen or a better piece. So then you can achieve checkmate, right? So and that brings us to the second thing that you must try to do in the endgame: try to promote a pawn, because the first player to promote a pawn and get a new queen will usually win the game. All right. If your opponent is smart, they will probably try to prevent you from promoting a pawn, since it's very important to promote a pawn in the end game. All right, I'll show you a few examples of how you can do this. So in this, we talked about this a little last week. What you're trying to do in this situation is achieve opposition, right? So white has a king and one pawn, and he wants to promote the pawn and then checkmate black with the king and queen. But obviously, the black king will try to prevent this. If white goes here without thinking, all right. So the black king will be in time to capture the pawn once it promotes. If he just moves the pawn like from d5 to d6 to d7 to d8 without doing anything, the black king can get there in time and capture it, okay? By going from king to f6 to f7 and taking it. So that's why white has to use the idea known as opposition to prevent the black king from coming closer to the pawn. So basically what white is trying to do here is trying to zone out the black king so this pawn can safely make it to the end. All right. So white should move the king here so he can prevent the king from going to f6. So if king goes to f6 trying to get to d8 square, white just moves the king to e6 and prevents that from happening as well. Right. White can then take the opposition by moving the king here, and eventually white will reach this position where his pawn can only promote safely. The opposition is a very important idea in the endgame. You can sometimes also use it to push away your opponent's king. In the position below, black's king doesn't want to allow the white pawn to promote for obvious reasons, but white can use opposition to force the black king to leave. White moves here and takes the opposition, all right? White will use the power of opposition to force the black king away from the square where white wants to promote. All right, so then black's king cannot go either left or right in the situation. Either way, the king just moves to the respective square, the opposite of where the black king moves, and he just supports his pawn to the e8 square, so he can promote. All right, so this is another reason why you should bring your king into action in endgame, because if your king wasn't this close, then he would not be able to support his pawn. All right, so let's look at other ideas of how you can promote your pawn. Use a breakthrough, all right? So in this situation, you're trying to promote your c5 pawn into the c8 square, but obviously the pawn on b7 is getting in the way. So if, in other words, if none of your opponent's pawns can stop your pawn anymore. So once a pawn cannot be stopped by other pawns, then we refer to that pawn as a passed pawn. So once this pawn is in this situation here, we call it a passed pawn, like P-A-S-S-E-D, right? Because the black pawns can't allow, won't allow a white pawn to simply pass through. For example, if white goes here, white plans a breakthrough, right? So in this situation, you're trying to get your c pawn to the c8 square, but the b7 pawn is blocking that option. So what you do in this case is move your pawn to a6, attacking this pawn, and then the black pawn will be forced to take it, and then you can move your c pawn up. Even if he doesn't take it, if he just moves to b6, then you can still promote. If black doesn't do anything, you take that pawn and promote. All right. So that's what a breakthrough is. You use another piece to break through and get your passed pawn to the end. All right. Here's another example of a breakthrough example. All right. So the pawn on b6, you're trying to promote that to the end, but that's being blocked by the b7 pawn. So how can white unblock the pawn on b6? Anyone have any guesses? All right, so the answer to this is use the bishop. You see the bishop on g2? You can even sacrifice the bishop. So white is willing to sacrifice the bishop because it will allow the pawn to promote. Initially, this move appears to be a mistake. You're just blundering. It might look like you're just blundering a bishop to for a pawn, but white will lose 2 points here by sacrificing the bishop for a pawn. But once this pawn takes back, there's nothing stopping the b6 pawn from promoting. And the pawn will promote to a queen. So what's greater, a queen or a bishop? Obviously a queen, right? So that's why it was a good idea to sacrifice the bishop. You lost 3 points, but you got a new queen worth 9 points. So this is an important thing that you must do in the endgame to try to promote a pawn. All right, the third thing that you should do in an endgame is to cut off your opponent's king, all right? So in this situation, you're trying to promote the pawn to d8, but this king can get in the way. So the way you can promote this pawn is by cutting off the king. So since you have a rook here, you can move that rook to e1, and the king can't pass through anymore. It can't attack this pawn. All right. So it's not always possible to cut off your opponent's king, but when you do get the opportunity, it's a very good idea, right? So these are the So these are the three things that you should do in the endgame. Bring your king closer to help your other pieces. Try to promote a pawn and cut off your opponent's king if you get the chance to do so. All right, so now we're going to be talking about the three things that you should not do in the endgame. And the first thing that you should do is don't make fast moves simply because there are fewer pieces on the board. It's a mistake that many people make. They believe that they can quickly move the pieces because there's only a few pieces on the board, but they often end up losing the game or drawing when they could win. All right. So that's the first thing that you shouldn't do. Don't make fast moves. All right. All right. The second thing that you should not do in the end game is don't easily allow your opponent to promote a pawn. So here's what I mean. All right. So in this situation, you can see that the pawn on a5 is threatening to promote to a1. So you're gonna have to stop that somehow. So the solution in this scenario is by moving your king closer, right? So the white king must act immediately to deal with black's passed pawn on a5. So if you notice that your opponent wants to promote a pawn, then you shouldn't wait. You should immediately make a plan to be sure that you can stop it. It's easy to think the pawn is still a long way off, but when it gets closer to your side of the board, you may suddenly realize it's too late to stop it. So be sure you can stop the opponent's pawn before it's too late. As you can see here, it appears that the black pawn still has a long way to go before it can promote, but in fact, it is important to do something now, otherwise it will be too late. All right, so if the white king doesn't move closer to the a pawn in this exact move, then black can promote that. So he has to move immediately in this situation. Oh, all right, so if you want to try visualizing what would happen if white just makes a pawn move, then go for it. White would be too late in this situation, right? So instead of carelessly moving a pawn, you should see in your mind that if you want to be in time to stop the pawn, then you must react quickly. So if white acts quickly, then he will just in time be able to capture the pawn when it promotes. The pawn will promote and then he will capture it in the same move, right? It's also important that you practice to visualize and calculate moves in your mind without moving the pieces. So it's a very useful skill when you play chess, but because if you're good at it, then it can help you see the things that are coming that maybe your opponent didn't see. Okay, so if you can sometimes see the stuff that even your opponent didn't look at. And then the final thing that you should not do in the endgame is that you shouldn't advance your pawns if you can't support them. Here's an example, right? All right, so white wants to promote the pawn, but he must be careful, all right? Don't advance your pawns if you can't support it. All right, so white wants to promote his pawn, and without thinking, he moves it forward. White will now lose the pawn because he can't support it. But black sees white's plan, and he prepares to stop it by moving his rook back. And he will actually soon take the pawn. And this is sad for white because if he had more patience, then he may have been able to promote that pawn. All right. So in the okay, so all right, so you should try to promote this pawn because the first player to promote a pawn will usually win the game, right? So the three things that you should do in the end game is you should activate your king. You should activate your king. You should try to promote a pawn, and you should try to zone off the enemy king if you can do so. And the three things that you should not do in the end game: don't make fast moves, be patient with promoting your pawn, and try to react as fast as possible when the enemy is promoting their own pawns. All right. So anyone have any questions on the stages so far? Actually, we're done, but anyone have any questions? All right. So if you guys have any questions, or if you guys have want any resources, you can contact me. You guys can take a picture of this. Yeah. Pungdi auntie.
Yes, Kevin, done.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Great job. Very good job. Actually, yeah, I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Okay. Good. Okay. So, hi, good morning, everyone, kids. Hope you all enjoyed today's session, right? Okay. This is the last